Everybody, I'm Jenny from Calm Healthy Horses, and most of you probably already know Vicky Hanson. Vicky's going to be my assistant this evening. So tonight we're going to focus on the somewhat overlooked and certainly underestimated subject, and that is the grass that we're all trying to keep our domestic horses on these days. So it turns out there are several aspects of your horse's pasture grass that you really do need to understand because they have such a significant influence on his health and his movement and his behavior. Everything you're trying to do, in fact. And there's a broad spectrum of signs that the grass might be affecting your horse. Some are only minor, and of course some are very serious. Everything from whether he's a bit spooky on your ride or at your lesson today, right through to him being completely unrideable because he's become a head shaker or a flicker, as we call them in New Zealand, or maybe he's even developed laminitis. So like we and many of you have personally experienced, some of these issues can just become all-consuming. They kind of take over your life. And because they're very easily misinterpreted, people will wind up spending a lot of time always trying to get the horse right, when really what you need to get right is his management and his forage and his feed. So you'll find, like we have, that when you get those right, then all the issues tend to resolve and, you'll really start to enjoy your horses. So there's no need to remember everything that we're explaining here tonight. It is being recorded, and by the end you'll have a good understanding and some useful take-home messages. So on the way through, you're welcome to submit your questions on the chat, and then at the end, Vicky can read them out to me and we can answer them then. So where's the next one? Okay, so what does Calm Healthy Horses actually do? Well, we respond to inquiries and we help people resolve issues. So that involves giving in-depth management advice, which we've done for a lot of years now. And of course, over the years, due to necessity, we have developed a range of supporting supplements. But most of the people that come to us have already been down multiple avenues already. For example, Brossie. Vicky spotted Brossie at a one-day event, and on talking to his owner, Emily, she found out that he suffered from narcolepsy. He also had anhidrosis, and he was a head shaker, and he also had, sort of unusual behaviors, as Emily described them. So what we did is we, really talked to Emily about, his feed and how she was keeping him. And we, of course, supported her all the way through because it wasn't like an overnight fix. But after about 9-10 months, Brossie came back to the fabulous horse that he really is. So that's just one example. We just have a constant stream of people who are desperate for help for their horses. And they know that something's not right, and they've been searching for solutions for usually quite a long time. And they're just so grateful when, we can make suggestions that actually work. So the trouble is out there that we all make a lot of assumptions. Now, the first major assumption is that if you've got an area with some grass in it, and maybe a paddock shelter, that you can have a horse. And that sort of assumes that all grass is equal and all grass is going to be suitable for all horses. And of course, that's not really the case. The other thing that people assume, or, the general current theories out there, is that it's really only about the sugars. Well, we're going to show you in future slides that in actual fact, there's many other aspects, or, quite a few other aspects that actually cause more grief to the horse than the sugars. And in actual fact, in a lot of the forage analyses, the sugars are quite low. The other thing is that horses, when they develop something like head shaking, or they start getting footy, that is the first sign of the trouble. But in actual fact, it's been brewing along subclinically for quite some time. And it just takes a change in the grass, change in the weather, which causes the change in the grass, and then the horse's metabolism tips over, and you start seeing the symptoms on the outside. So the consequences are, vast also, of not understanding what we're talking about here tonight. Because you can spend a lot of time and a lot of money. You can go through a lot of stress, frustration, and if you don't look out, it can cost you years. I mean, we don't want you guys to, look back like we do on horses that we've owned in the past, and wish that we knew then what we know now. And these days it's kind of become mainstream to get your horses tested for everything, and then they get assigned a label. They're EMS, they're IR, they're head shakers, SIJ, sacroiliac joint problems, PSSM, or they're idiopathic, which means nobody can figure out what the cause of the problems is. And the trouble is, when you assign a horse a label, everybody thinks that the horse is defective, when really it's his management that is defective. So what it boils down to is that if your horse is on unsuitable forage, it sooner or later affects his body chemistry. Now, you can see the example in the picture on the right, that horse actually has chemistry problems, not training problems. And you can see that his muscles are tight, he's not moving properly, he's traveling all hollow, his head's in the air, he doesn't look very happy, neither does his rider. And we would look at that horse now and we would say he's not ready for any training, because he just can't do what he's being asked to do, because he can't think, and he's, things aren't feeling right to him. So it's really important to recognize when there are chemistry problems and not treat them as training problems. So just a bit of background, because this helps it helps everything to make sense. Where exactly are horses designed to live? Well, they evolved on grasslands and semi-arid environments, actually on the big plains and steppes of North America and Europe. And in those regions, it's actually too dry for trees. They're actually well adapted to dry and cold environments. And of course, what have we got? We're trying to keep them in tropical or subtropical and temperate climates, which tend to be wet. And sure, it's us, we humans, that have moved horses to these regions of the planet. And sure, they survive, but they don't necessarily thrive without quite a lot of help from us. So in Australia, of course, you've got a very diverse climate range. The trouble is, the best areas for horses are not where people want to live, because these grassland areas, which are the sort of beigey colour there, they're kind of in the, better for the horse category, whereas everybody in Australia lives around the edge. And of course, you've got the tropical and the subtropical and the temperate climates down here in Victoria, a lot of South Australia and Tasmania. So if you compare the two different environments, the one that they're adapted to, where it hardly rains, so the soil actually lacks organic matter. It's very rarely green, and there's no fences, so they're very low stocking rates, and forage or feed tends to be on the sparse end of the spectrum, versus the sort of environment we're trying to keep them in, where it rains regularly. The soils are organic, obviously, and we kind of help them to be more organic. It can be green all year. If we're lucky, it browns off for a few months of the year, or in some parts of Australia, maybe lucky enough to have it brown off for more. And of course, we put fences up, and all the horse has to do, he doesn't have to expend any energy. He just has to turn off those neck muscles, and gravity drops his head into a feast. So what are horses designed to eat? Well, they are designed to eat grasses. 80 to 90% of their diet is naturally grasses, and about 10% they can also consume, or browse on woody stem bushes and a few herbs and different plants when they crop up or when grasses are scarce. So hence they've developed a monogastric style digestive system, not a ruminant style one. They evolved in these low potassium and low nitrogen settings. They also have a sort of a cyclical or seasonal diet. And what that means that over the long, harsh winter, their metabolism gets a rest. And then they might get some green in the spring. And then they fatten up on the mature grasses and seed heads over the late summer and autumn, ready for the next long, hard winter. So you can see it's a completely different kind of diet and environment that they are designed for to what we're trying to keep them in. So, of course, in Australia, you've got the subtropical and tropical environments. Anything with tropical in it, that's the environments that horses are least adapted to. The temperate climates, they tend to be colder, but also they're obviously wetter than what the horse would prefer. And of course, in quite a few areas, it's evergreen. And you get, in Australia, you've either got your warm season grasses in more or less the top half of the country, and, from the about halfway down and below, you tend to have more of the cool season grasses. Now, it doesn't really matter whether they're warm or cool season. I mean, there are advantages, pros and cons of both, but it does pay to know whether your horse is grazing warm season or cool season grasses. So both of the pastures in those photos are unsuitable. Now, in the top one, that grass is very stressed because it's trying to grow. It has the conditions to grow, but it can't make any sugars. Normally the grass produces sugars during the day, which it converts into structural carbohydrate or more grass into growth at night. But when the grass is so short like that all the time, there's no leaf area for the plant to make sugars. So the plant, it's getting the temperature to grow, the moisture and the nutrients out of the soil, but it can't actually grow because it's grazed all the time and there's no leaf area to photosynthesize and make the sugars. So that means it also doesn't use up the potassium and crude protein that it also needs to grow. So that's your stress grass. Now, the thing is, a lot of horse people look at grass like that and they think, oh, that's probably quite good for my horse because I'm trying to keep her weight in check. and she won't get very much per mouthful, but in actual fact, it can still cause, all the different troubles that we see in the horses. And of course, the grass in the picture below is longer. It's been left to grow, so the blades do have leaf area. They can make sugars. So potentially that grass can be high in potassium, crude protein, and sugars. And basically, it's too much nutrition with each mouthful for most or for many horses. So what you're going to find is that a mature stage of growth of your grass, it's not always easy to achieve, I know, is your friend, because the aspects that affect horses when grass is green and growing, tend to be far less the more mature the plant is, because the mature plant is no longer trying to grow. So it doesn't have the requirement for the nitrogen, the potassium, even the oxalates are far more numerous or, prevalent in the young growing warm season grasses. And of course, the plant doesn't need to make sugars because it's finished growing. So that's why a mature stage of growth, whether it's grass, if you've got enough land to be able to keep that sort of grass ahead of your horses, or whether you choose to feed a good proportion of his diet as hay. So I've included some of these forage analyses because, I don't know, people think that we make all this stuff up. And, this was a forage analysis we did of some short green grass and clover that caused a thoroughbred horse to go down with laminitis. Now, he wasn't the sort of horse you would expect to develop laminitis. He was a thoroughbred and he was getting some hay. This is autumn grass. He was getting some hay at night and some in the morning. But the rest of the time he was nibbling around on this very short grass and clover. And his owner, called, in distress one day because when she went out there in the morning, he couldn't walk. So, of course, we went racing over there and we decided we would take a sample of that grass and send it away to be analysed. Now, to get the sample, we had to crawl around on our hands and knees with nail scissors to get enough of a sample because the grass was so short. But it was very interesting when it came back because the sugars were actually quite low, well, acceptable, 7%. Even the non-structural carbohydrate total is only less than 5%. The crude protein, though, which includes the nitrates, was 36%. Now, that is toxically high. That would be toxic to any livestock. Even cows would be in trouble consuming pasture that is 36% crude protein. And of course, the potassium is 3.4%, and that's very high as well. So you can see that it wasn't the sugars that caused that horse to develop laminitis. Now, luckily, because his owner acted quickly and we got some goodies into him and we, of course, removed him from that grass and he came right within a couple of days. Now, this is fresh pasture from the Gold Coast, and this is kind of warm season pasture, and that was recently analysed. And you can see the potassium is actually quite high in that, but that's probably because the grass was picked after a row of cloudy days, and it was actually raining at the time. The crude protein is still pretty high, but the sugars are very low. The water-soluble carbohydrates, only 5%. That's very low. We also got some lucerne tested, and you can see the potassium still over 2%. We'd like it to be around 1% for horses. which is what you do get in that mature grass or that late cut hay. And the crude protein in the lucerne also very high, but the sugars are around or just under 8%. So the thing is about plants is they love potassium, and so they luxury uptake it. They uptake far more than what they actually need. And at the same time, excuse me, because they don't have any requirement for salt or sodium, they don't uptake hardly any sodium. So that means if your horse is out on, short green or lush green pasture all year round, and you add lucerne to his diet, you can see that you're really putting your horse's metabolism, his adrenals and his kidneys, which have to deal with all that, you're putting them under stress, chronic stress. Now, horses are like us. We're all adapted to temporary spikes, like those, the horses when they were evolving, temporary, sporadic green spells, not evergreen all year round or most of the year green spells. So potassium is just one of the issues you need to be mindful of, and it's cumulative over the whole diet. So you have to kind of take a mental note of, what you're pretty sure the horse is getting out of his green grass. Well, he's getting a lot out of any green growing grass. And that's why we tend to not add lucerne, because you're only adding to his load. Now, there's times when, and I'll go over that. Well, I think we talk about lucerne. Here. So there are, sort of regions where lucerne does fit in a lot better, and that's obviously on your warm season grasses where they're not quite so high in potassium and crude protein already. So it entirely depends on what is in the rest of the diet, whether your horse can handle lucerne or not. So it shouldn't really be fed any more than 10% of their total forage. And okay with warm season mature grass, but not like that picture on the right there. You can see that grass would already be high in potassium and crude protein. So you would avoid adding any more. You avoid prime lucerne. That's like first cut, bright green. I've seen it over there. It's like emerald green. Honestly, you would not feed that to your horses. It will be very high in potassium and crude protein. So shedded or grassy lucerne is much better. A lot of people feed lucerne, or they're told to, because before exercise, because obviously it's good. It helps form that mat over the horse's stomach acid, so the stomach acid doesn't slosh around so much. But actually any hay works. It doesn't have to be lucerne hay. You just don't want to be riding your horse on an empty stomach. So if you do live in the northern half, more or less, or even if your horse is on kikuyu grass, I know there's a lot of kikuyu in Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia and Western Australia. These are the ones we strike the most, the Soteria up in Queensland and Buffalo, and around the internal areas of Australia. Those are quite high oxalate grasses, especially in the late spring and summer, especially when the grass is growing, rapidly, especially after any rain or irrigation. And of course, slashing is like, also kind of keeps the grass vegetative, and it will keep it higher in the oxalates. Now, teff hay also has some oxalates, but you can live with it so long as you compensate with a good calcium supplement. It's the big problems are obviously if, like that horse in the top right there, that was its only forage No one was feeding that horse anything else, and you can see it's clearly developed big head. And we visited another place. It was a stud where the predominant grass was kikuyu, and they had a lot of trouble with developmental orthopedic diseases. So if you've got breeding or growing horses, they already have an increased requirement, especially for the macro minerals. So if they're also grazing oxalate grasses, then you really do have to attend to that aspect of their diet. The other thing that we learnt when we were visiting people in the inland Queensland areas is there are large tracts of land that are very low in phosphorus in Australia because of the heavy weathering of the soils over the years. So that's something you need to just be cognizant of also. So it pays, in Australia especially, to be calcium conscious. So in other words, you need to know whether your horse is grazing warm or cool season grasses. And you need to understand, be mindful of the stage of growth and try and make the predominant forage more mature. And you also need to understand what else you are feeding that is low calcium, high phosphorus, like grains, for instance. I know a lot of people steer clear of grains, but they still, if you're feeding oats or barley, you need to know that they are also low calcium, high phosphorus. Your brands, of course, your rice brands and wheat brands, and all your protein meals. Copra is very low calcium. Flaxseed, your sunflower, your hemp, your lupins, they're all tend to be low calcium, high phosphorus. Now, beet, interestingly, is the opposite. So it's a good thing to mix in with these. It goes some way towards balancing things up. But basically, most people in Australia need to be feeding a really good calcium, properly formulated calcium supplement. So there's different, ways that, calcium phosphorus imbalances affect the horse. Besides the oxalates, you can get the sort of bone remodeling. You get these lumps popping up in funny places. Now, they do go down, takes time, but they do tend to resorb and come back to normal. So a major concern about short or lush green growing grass is the nitrate content. Now, once again, plants uptake nitrogen as nitrates. And of course, because horses didn't evolve to on high nitrate sort of forage, their digestive system isn't equipped to handle them. Monogastrics of, not just horses, but other monogastrics and horses have no requirement for nitrates. But they still, if they're consumed, they still have to be kind of processed and excreted. So in the meantime, they cause digestive upsets. You can get your soft, sloppy manure, right through to diarrhea, serious upset to the microbiome. They can cause an inflammatory response in the intestinal lining. And, I'm sure they're involved in the good old fecal water syndrome and a lot of the other digestive problems that people have. So because they have to be processed and excreted, one of the ways is that the excess nitrogen is converted in the liver to urea, and then it's excreted in the urine. But another way, especially in the absence of enough salt in the diet, is that latches on to calcium and magnesium. So the nitrates become like a calcium and magnesium thief. And those are kind of precious minerals for your horse that you don't really want to be losing out to the process of excreting excess nitrates. So it's another good reason why we don't want to be fertilizing traditionally, over harrowing or fertilizing our horse pastures, because you're only adding nitrogen, potassium to the soils, which is the last thing that horses need to be consuming. Now down southern half of Australia especially, I've seen lots of people have problems with capeweed and other broadleafs, the unwanted species, but particularly capeweed. We get more catsia here in New Zealand. But these sort of what we would call weeds are nitrate accumulators. So it's best to try and eliminate them through, well, early in the season. But they tend to take over when the grass gets short. So when the grass is overgrazed, they tend to take over. So be wary. I mean, I've seen people and that's all their horses have got to eat. So obviously that is not a healthy diet. So young, lush, oxalate grasses, that's Soteria in the picture at the top there. Mixtures of kikuyu and clover. These, we get lots of people have troubles with their horses on these sort of mixtures. And of course, if you do get the droughts and you get the drought-breaking rains, you get the, that sort of fluorescent short green shoots popping out of the ground. So you want to be very wary of those and have somewhere to put your horse to protect your horse from that sort of grass. So you need to know the main species that your horse is growing. You need to be able to recognize ryegrass, for instance, especially if you're in the cool season areas. And ryegrass is easily recognized with its alternate little seed heads on the stem there, you can see in the picture, but also because it shines in the sun. And it's the only grass that shines in the sun. So it's pretty easy on a sunny day to see how much of your pasture is ryegrass. Kikuyu, of course, gets very high crude protein when it's short and green and growing like that. Other aspects about the grass that you need to be aware of is in your clovers and your lucernes, they contain hormonally active compounds, now otherwise known as phytoestrogens, and these really affect your mare's cycling. We've got 7 mares that we had before, like about 10, 12 years ago, before we started keeping our horses the way we do now. And they lived on ryegrass and clover. And every spring was a nightmare. They would have raging seasons, embarrassing behavior. And, it was not pleasant. You'd hear the squealing, kicking, striking, goodness knows what going on out there. But now, in about 10 years since keeping our horses basically on a track, on a very high hay diet, no legumes, no clovers, no lucerne in their diet. Do you know what our comment is? Our comment is, gee, did they even come into season? And of course they do, but it's hardly noticeable. It's no different to having a gelding. And of course, the hormonally active compounds can affect geldings as well. Another aspect in any sort of very dark green plants like clover, lucerne, ryegrass, are the fluorescing or photodynamic pigments. Because when horses eat these, they get into the bloodstream and they react with UV light when they get to the unpigmented skin, and they cause the oozy sores, and hey presto, you've got mud fever and you've got sunburn. So that's another reason to eliminate those from your horse's diet, because then you just don't have those problems. We've got several horses with big white faces and we never have to worry about the sun, the hot sun here in Canterbury anymore. And of course, in some areas, You do have to worry about mycotoxins, and you'll add a toxin binder to your horse's feed. I mean, originally, when we first started on this nutritional sort of journey, we thought everything was down to mycotoxins. And, you know, we would feed the toxin binders, and then if things were still not improving, we would feed more toxin binders. But what we actually found out was the toxin binders only work on mycotoxins, and they don't work on mineral imbalances and high nitrates and high potassium and etc. So your mycotoxins are another factor, but not a large one on the scale of things. And a healthy horse with a healthy liver can handle a few mycotoxins. So can you actually balance to your horse's forage when it comes to vitamins and minerals? Well, you can't when there's a lot of vegetative or even some vegetative grass in his diet, because those content, you know, the nutrient content is changing with the weather and the season, etc. It is possible, if the diet is 100% hay and you're getting all that hay from one source, it is possible, but it's actually not necessary. It's a very complex thing to do, because it is not just a matter of looking to see what is lacking or deficient and topping those things up, because excesses like potassium and nitrates become antagonists. Like I said, they rob your horse of calcium and magnesium, so you need to compensate for that. So it's not just a simple matter of looking at what's a bit low and just feeding those. The other thing is that minerals don't work without their cofactors. So that's why you have a broad spectrum vitamin, mineral, amino acid supplement, rather than just a bit of this and a bit of that. So what you do need to make sure that you're doing is feed your horse the 5 main food groups in the right proportions that will keep him healthy. Like, you can't expect your forage, whether it's healthy grass or whether it's hay or mature grass, it's not going to be supplying all his nutrition. And of course, what we find a lot of people are doing is they're feeding a lot of random bits of this and bits of that. So you want to have your hay-based diet, so that provides the fiber. Everyone's very aware that they need to keep the horse's microbiome as healthy as possible. So you need to make sure that the microbiome have a constant stream of coarse fibrous material. So and we want the horses to be able to eat all day long. So if you've got really sort of rich forage, then, you know, like years ago, we were sold the idea of sort of organically tending the soil and growing, you know, very healthy grass. Now, there's merit in this idea. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but what we found was that we grew prolific grass, and we couldn't let the horses out there for more than about 5 minutes a day, because they would just pile on the weight, and you'd see all the EMS symptoms, and this is what people reported. So we need that sort of late cut, low nutrient density hay as their basic forage in a lot of cases. And that way they can be eating all day and they don't have to go hours without food. You know, one of the worst things to see is people locking up their horses and they're not feeding them properly. That is very sad and totally unnecessary. So we need to give them plenty of fiber and carbs, you know, structural carbs, coarse fibrous material. They need some protein in their diet. And we recommend the oil seeds for protein because it's non-nitrate protein. You know, lucerne tends to be nitrate protein. It's a plant, you know, the proteins in the stems and the leaves. And the oil seeds not only provide the protein, but they also provide the fatty acids. So a combination of ground linseed and sunflower seeds is really good. It supplies your protein and your fatty acids. And then you need to add your broad spectrum minerals, vitamins, amino acids, and of course your salt. Because remember, horses don't lick salt licks like cattle do. They've got smooth tongues, and so they don't lick enough off a salt lick. You can have a salt lick out there as well, but make sure they get their basic requirements in their feed. And, you know, the horses in Australia, they need a properly formulated calcium supplement so that you're feeding so the horses thrive and not just survive. So on your property, if you're in a position where you can do this, or if where you adjust, they're open to the idea. More and more adjusting people are starting to understand that really they need to have some options available, because there's some people out there who are in pretty sticky situations because they're renting grazing at the local pony club, and the grazing is fertilized every year so that, you know, there's plenty of grass for the horses and ponies, but it's also causing a lot of problems, and there's nowhere for these people to get their horses off the grass and to give them, you know, more hay every day. So what you do, if you can, is you create your own mini desert. Now, sometimes people do it like this picture in the top. They kind of graze it all the way around so that it gets trashed, but you're far better off covering it up behind the horses so that the horses aren't back grazing on this short green grass. This was a wonderful track that I visited when I was over in Western Australia. Of course, it's easy to make tracks when you've got nice dry country. So the more serious the issues that your horse has, the more meticulous you've got to be about having a grass-free area. A lot of horses do just fine on a mixture of turnout and, you know, obviously being supplied plenty of hay every day. And whatever you're doing, it can be a work in progress. Like, you can do what you can with the resources you've got this year and just keep adding to it every year. And people are making some wonderful environments for their horses. So you need to assess what grass you've got available and make a decision from there as to what facilities that you're going to need to help you to manage that grass. Then you need to look at the total diet, and obviously we can help you with all of that. It's something that you need to work at. Observe, compare, adjust, review, because it's a bit like riding. You don't learn to ride in one lesson, and feeding your horse in your situation on your property or where he's grazing, well, that takes, you develop a feel for it, let's say. And it takes a bit of time, but it gets easier as time goes by. So just to sum it up, when you get it right for the horse, the benefits are endless. Your horse, you know, the stress is, there's just no stress anymore. You're not worried about them, you know, what's going wrong with them now. The horse is much nicer and more comfortable to ride. You'll have more riding time, and of course you make progress. So that about wraps it up. I'm sure that you've got some questions there. So Vicky, do you want to read out some of the questions?